In Romans chapter 12, Paul is concluding his letter to the Romans, and he's beseeching us to present our bodies as a living sacrifice to God. Welcome to your daily 180 Bible study. Here in Romans 12, verse 1, Paul says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. We're talking here about the concept of sacrifice, and that was something that was well understood to the people of Israel living in the Old Testament. You can turn to the book of Leviticus and read about all of the different kinds of offerings that the people were to bring to God. There were peace offerings, there were sin offerings, there were whole burnt offerings. There were all sorts of different sacrifices they were to bring, and they were all to be offered in a very specific way. And those who were attending to the altar, the Levites and the priests, they were supposed to be experts in knowing how those sacrifices were to be offered to God, and there were a lot of them. We're told in the Old Testament about many sacrifices that were brought to God. In 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse number 4, we're told that King Solomon, for example, offered 1,000 offerings on the altar that stood in Gibeon, and that was before the temple was built in Jerusalem. Well, that's a lot of sacrifices. But then in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 63, we read about the time when Solomon dedicated the temple in Jerusalem and the altar that stood before it, and the blood really began to flow. There were tens of thousands of sacrifices, we're told, that were put on that altar at that one specific point in time. And from that time forward, there must have been hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of animals that were slaughtered over the centuries. And yet, as we read in the book of Hebrews chapter 10, it simply is not possible for the blood of bulls and goats, however many they may have been, to take away a single act of sin and its consequence. What was it going to take? It would take a free will offering. Jesus would come and give His own body that God had prepared for Him for the sins of all the world. And then we turn here to Romans chapter 12, where Paul says, now I want you to present your bodies, not as a dead, lifeless sacrifice, but as a living sacrifice to God that is holy and acceptable in His sight. We hope you'll continue to be with us as we continue in this study from God's Word.